So just as we're about to start now, I'm going to just share my video with you. For anybody who has just joined, just to mention that these webinars are recorded, so we can share them at a later point should anyone wish to see them or wish to share them. That was perfectly fine. My name is Gary. Hello. I'm the Managing Director of the agency, as I've already said. So I'm going to talk to you about GDPR, and we're going to go through a presentation now. So I think it's first and foremost, why have I put this presentation together, this webinar? The title is born out of a couple of conversations with people this last sort of couple of months really, and leading up to the Data Protection World Forum, which I attended last week, which was excellent, and I would highly recommend anyone to go along to. But people were genuinely in business. When I go to a networking event, people were saying to me, such as things like GDPR, is that still a thing? Is that something I still need to be worried about? And then there would be other people who would say, GDPR, this is still really quite important. So that's the reason why this presentation, this webinar was put together. So thank you for participating with it, so coming on with it. Hopefully you'll find it of interest. And as I said, I will be sharing the presentation should you wish to see it. I want to stop my video now because you don't want to see me, and we'll go through this presentation. So I'm going to go through this now fairly quickly. As said, hopefully we'll have opportunity at the end for you to ask questions. We will be recording this, so I will share it with everybody. By way of introduction, as I've already mentioned, I'm the Managing Director of agency. We're a cybersecurity company. The best way I can describe what we do really is we look after information governance and risk and compliance. So we look after many different forms of compliance around information and how it's used. So anything between ISO 27001 to ISO 22301, business continuity and quality, and anything and everything in between. I've been involved in this for a very long time. I've been a data protection officer for about 20 years, and I've been in IT for about 35 years. But as a data protection officer, information security practitioner for 20 years, I've seen the world evolve in its way and use of information and data, as we all have. And of course, this year, at the beginning of this year, everybody was in a panic about GDPR. In fact, if you went to anybody started to mention the word GDPR, the reaction was something like this. If they were a business owner or a business leader, it would be sort of a look of horror and shock and fear that they had to do something. And then, of course, there were the practitioners that were out there, and the people like my good self and who'd been doing this a long time, who were saying, wow, at last people are starting to talk about GDPR and data protection in positive ways. And we were starting to get some real traction around data protection, I feel. Now, it was interesting that many organizations were coming to us saying, I have to be compliant by the 25th of May. And we were saying to people, you don't have to be compliant by the 25th of May. You need to be able to demonstrate you're doing the right things. And it's not just the 25th of May. This is for life now. This is a new way of operating. But amazingly, after the 25th of May comes Saturday, the 26th, it kind of went a little bit quiet. It was, organizations looked around and said, well, the world hasn't come tumbling down around my ears, so everything is going back to normal. And to some respects, they're absolutely correct, and that's fine. I do understand why there was that sort of peak, and many of my colleagues, when I was at the forum last week, we were all saying very similar things, that the first half of 2018 seemed to be lots of people selling on FUD, on fear, uncertainty and doubt. But, we needed to have this new regulation in for a reason. Those of us who really believe that we should be looking after data in the correct way, we were never trying to sell the benefits of GDPR through fear, uncertainty, and doubt. In fact, we actually would echo the words of Elizabeth Denham, the Information Commissioner, who stated that GDPR was the biggest change in data protection laws in over 20 years. And it was fundamentally having to change the way that we think about data protection. She also said that it was a more 21st century approach to info security because we're living in a different world than where we were back in 1998 when the Data Protection Act really came into its own back then. If you don't believe me, if you think, you know, the world has not changed, you think that actually we can carry on as we always have, you know, I will not selling on fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but on facts. You know, I would urge you to read this paper. This is the Department for Digital Culture and Media and Sport. This is their latest paper, the Cybersecurity Breaches Survey. It's worth taking a look at if you are trying to convince anyone that GDPR is still important. Unfortunately, we know that the bad guys are out there, and you know they are going to make good with our data and our information, and with you know, all those things that we've accumulated to try and protect. You know, there are bad actors out there looking to take that away from us. So we need to think about protecting ourselves better. That's what GDPR is all about. And when I talk about cybersecurity breaches, people instantly think I'm only going to focus on, you know, the hackers and the cyber criminals out there. But it's not just those people that we need to be protected from. Unfortunately, we need to be protected from ourselves to some extent. Just yesterday, this was a news report that came out that Facebook confirms year-old messages are randomly coming back to haunt users. Now, it's a small news story when you consider the implications and issues that Facebook have had over the last 12 months themselves. But it's again another demonstration that we're putting information out there that once it's out there, we don't control it. Somebody else controls it. Indeed, somebody else feels that they own it. And I don't know about you, but personally, I think it's important that we take that control back and that we actually hold that information you know, in some high regard, and that it is protected appropriately. And when I say appropriately, what I mean by that is that I think GDPR simply means giving data proper respect. It's something I've said ever since the very beginning of the fact that this acronym came about back in 2012, 2013, when the regulation itself was starting to form. So I've been saying all that time, if you want to know what GDPR about is, it's just about giving data proper respect. It really is a balancing act. It's a balancing act between the rights of the individual to privacy, that's you and I, and it's about the rights of the organization to actually have, be able to use that data for their own purposes as well. Now, we should have been doing this all along. Why haven't we been doing this all along? Or why should we have been doing this all along? Well, the Data Protection Act of 1998 states that that's what we should have been doing. You could see down here, this is something that you'll have seen many, many times, I'm sure. You'll be very familiar with it. So we should have been giving data proper respect, and we should have had that balancing act between the rights of the individual and the rights of an organization all the way along. So why did it cause such consternation when you put GDPR alongside the old Data Protection Act? We can see that they're very, very similar. In fact, if you look at the regulation on the right, the GDPR, the first principle about that personal data shall be processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner, I feel is one of the reasons why this caused so much consternation and concern. So when people say to me, you know, GDPR, are we still talking about this? To some degree, I would say, yeah, I'm surprised too, because I think we should have always been talking about data protection and always been saying to organizations and to individuals that we will look after that data that they have entrusted to us. Now, of course, under GDPR, there is an additional principle that we should all be aware of, and that additional principle is known as the principle of accountability. And this principle of accountability simply states that we will, that someone within the organization will have to demonstrate that you are looking after data in the appropriate way. That an organization can demonstrate that, not just one individual, but the whole organization can demonstrate that it is holding that information in a transparent manner. And there's ways that we're going to do that, and we're going to explain that and explore that in a little bit in this presentation that I'm giving to you now. Again, just to emphasize the point, why I think that we should have always been doing this anyway, is that data has a value. It has always had a value. When you think about when you are building your business, or you're working with organizations who are building business, they will talk about the cost of acquisition, of acquiring new clients. You know, what is the cost of marketing? What is the cost of, you know, fostering good relationships with organizations and individuals? There's always been a cost to that. Unfortunately, that cost is now being transferred into ones and zeros, and all of us have become almost a commodity. And the bad actors, the criminals, etc., and big business recognize that we have all become like oil. Data is the new oil, and we have a value. And we need to protect that, because I don't know about you, but I don't like to be just thought of as a 1 and a 0 and as someone that can be mined. I like to think that somebody's out there looking after me and my interests. Now, one thing that we cannot do is simply hand this off to one department in our business and say it's their responsibility. Again, when organizations are coming to me and saying, are we still talking about this? My response to that is yes, and you should all be talking about this. You cannot hand GDPR to your IT crowd, your IT departments, and say, this is GDPR, make me compliant, make us compliant, make this problem go away. When I speak to organizations or individuals at networking events or seminars or conferences, and I ask them who is managing their data protection compliance program, quite often people will point to their IT and say, well, it's their responsibility, it's their job. And that's the reason why we are still talking about this, because there's many people in your organizations perhaps who haven't had the conversation. You haven't sat down with them and said, look, this is a collective responsibility. We all have to be involved in the conversation. Now, for those who have been involved in GDPR and have been working on this for any length of time, and certainly the first half of this year, you will have seen this diagram that was pushed out by the Information Commissioner's Office, where it said to people, this is what you need to do to prepare for the coming regulation. What are you going to do? You're going to raise awareness, you're going to identify information you hold, you're going to look at the communication of privacy rules, you're going to look at individuals' rights, how you gain consent, what do you do with children, what happens if something goes wrong and you have a data breach, how are you ensuring you're going to have privacy by design and default in all the services that you operate in. What about subject access requests? What about the lawful basis for which you're processing data? And who's going to manage it? Do you need a DPO? Do you need a data protection officer? And what do you do if you are operating internationally? All of these areas, I am absolutely confident these conversations were happening in every organization across the land, but they were probably only happening in silos. For those organizations who are operating this, or operating a good compliance program, we're having the conversations across the business. And I hope that describes you. If not, then go back to this plan. In fact, I'll share with you what agency do and what we believe is a good compliance program. And this is where we're going to go into a little bit more detail here. So I hope this is of interest. But again, if there is one slide that you take note of here, take a look at this. Because again, when I speak to people and they say, are we still talking about GDPR? My question to them is, well, when was the last time you spoke about GDPR? Because if the last time you spoke about GDPR was on the 25th of May, that was 6 months ago. It was more than 6 months ago. So you need to have the conversation again. You need to ensure you have a regular data audit. You need to ensure that you're reviewing all of these areas, your policies, your third parties, etc., which we'll explore a little bit further as we go through this presentation. But make sure that the organization that you work for, or that you own, that you run, is not just purely focused on a single point in time. You need to ensure that you are continually on this cycle. It's a compliance program. It's a journey. If you're wondering how to start this, well, I believe there's some key questions you need to ask, and it's very simple. You know, GDPR does not have to be complex. It starts with the simple what, where, when, why, how, who, that type of question. Understanding your organization. You can't protect what you don't understand. So I say to people, if you are struggling with this, with GDPR, and this is what I've said at the first half of this year, do these things. But even now, even 6 months down the line, we're coming up to the end of the year, it's a good time to have the conversations again with your business and say, well, okay, so who do we collect data from? Who do we share it with? What data do we have? You know, why do we need it? Where is it held? When do we erase it? How is it protected? And how is it destroyed? And how do we inform people of their rights? By going around this cycle for each one of your functions, in each of your areas, asking those very pertinent questions, you can again get an understanding of what your data protection health is currently, because you may have been able to run a marathon back on the 25th of May, but if you've sat around for the last 6 months and just eaten what you like, not bothered exercising, not bothered checking what you're putting into your body, not checking to see, you know, that you are living a healthy lifestyle, then come December, you're going to be back to the place where you were at the beginning of the year, which is bloated and with information that you really don't need. What I would also suggest and urge you to do is to go and look at your business in terms of risk, you know, prioritize based upon risk. This is about personal information here. So again, this is about personal information, personal data, which you probably all are aware of what personal data is. We may cover that a little bit later, but it's not company data. So your financial status and your intellectual property and such is not as much under scrutiny for GDPR as you might like to think it is. So look at your core systems that hold personal data. And establishing that, you'll understand what that levels of sensitivity are to you as your business as well. And what you can do is you can look at the sensitivities in terms of categorizing them. So what information should you have that is made public or could be made public? Information that's confidential, employee confidential, management restricted, and private. There's just a snapshot of a kind of a data classification, if you like, which you can employ within your business to understand what data is and where it should be held and how you should actually deal with it. So under each one of those, you can say, you can put guiding rules and guiding principles so that everybody understands what they've got to do. Another key area that you should be looking at now, again, 6 months down the line, if you've not done it recently, is to look at contracts. You know, GDPR could stand for gathering, developing, and protecting and responding to, you know, the contracts that you have. You are the data controller, and you know you'll have processes out there you need to understand. You know, data protection has some key players that we should all be aware of, as I've just mentioned, and that is, you know, people like the controller, and this is you. This is you know, means any natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or the body. You are the people who need to be ensuring that you are protecting data. You are the one setting the rules. You have processes, of course, and you know what is the contract that's in place between your processes, or indeed other joint controllers. Have you assessed those relationships? 25th of May was a long time ago. Have you brought any new processes in? Have you started working with anyone new in the last 6 months? It's worth taking a look at, because your responsibilities as the controller are quite far-reaching. You know, your job is to take into account the nature, scope, context, and purposes of processing, as well as the risk of varying likelihood and severity for the rights and freedoms of natural persons. And you need to be thinking about putting in those appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect that information and those rights. And those measures shall be reviewed and updated where necessary. We're still talking about this because we should, and we should be still talking about it, or we probably are still talking about it, because many organizations simply took their eye off the ball after the 25th of May. I hope that's not describing you. If you're a processor, you have responsibilities too, of course. So you need to make sure that you are that processing is being carried out on behalf of a controller. The controller shall use only processes providing sufficient guarantees to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. So when we're talking about these things then, excuse me, we need to think about not just contracts that we have with our third parties, but also internally as well. So what about your employees? Suppliers, absolutely, which we've just mentioned, but also your clients. So reviewing those kinds of things on an ongoing basis is absolutely the reason why we should still be talking about this. So what do we need to do? Well, I know it sounds simple, but let's take some action. Let's actually have those conversations. There are things that you need to have done already, and you probably have, and you also hopefully continue to do. For those who think that GDPR is just something that has been done to them, it isn't. It's absolutely always had to be in place. We should have always had these processes and these policies in place, such as these. We should have always had a data breach response and notification procedure. More often than not in the past, it's been known as a business continuity plan, but that business continuity plan is focused very much on what happens if there's a fire or flood, not what happens if we have a data breach. We should have always had a data breach register. We should always have a list of incidents that have happened so we can learn from those incidents. Excuse me. So that we should be able to learn from them. Now, I'm not going to go through each one, every single one of these, you'll be pleased to hear, but I'm just going to ask you to cast your eye over them for just 1 second. Now, looking down that list, hopefully you're ticking them off mentally in your mind, the ones that you already have in place. And if you don't have them in place, my question is, when are you going to put them in place? Should you start that conversation now and start to talk to people about GDPR in your organization again and say to them, we need to have that personal data protection policy reviewed because we've not looked at it for 6 months or a year? What about our records of processing activities? Now, the records of processing activities within the GDPR itself, it actually stipulates this is mandatory for organizations that have more than 250 employees. I'll be honest with you, and I would say that any organization would benefit from having a record of processing activities, because by having that, it will help you to identify where your data is. In years gone by, we just call that an information asset register. That's it. Where are your assets? How are they protected? Who do you share them with? Should that be mandated only for organizations that have more than 250 employees? I don't believe it should. I think we should all have that. So have those conversations within your organization and find out if they want to have that put in place, if you want to put that in place yourself. And of course, supplier data processing agreements, which we've already mentioned. All of these things together, they build up your compliance program. And ultimately, all they do is pull things together into one place so that you can actually protect the data that is there. You can ensure that you have confidentiality in place and integrity and availability. This is known as the CIA triad, and it's often talked about in technology terms and certainly within information security. Confidentiality, do people keep information confidential when they have access to it? If you've not looked at them in the last 6 months, how do you know? Integrity, can you trust them? Or can you trust the information that's in there? Is it accurate? If you're not updating it, if you're not reviewing it, if you're not having those conversations, how do you know? And will that information be available when it's needed? Are there systems or services that are putting your primary data at risk? What happens if your systems were to fail? Have you tested them recently? And would you know that that information would be available when it's needed? How do you know if you're not having those conversations? Now, in terms of the ICO themselves, they've talked about what would happen if there was a breach of any of these areas. And yes, we hear about fines. And again, going back to what I said right at the outset, I'm not here to sell on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I'm not going to talk about the percentages or the millions. But what I will talk about is under Article 83, that there are 11 considerations that the ICO will take, which will be taken into consideration when giving out a fine or any kind of enforcement. 11 things they will take into consideration. And I can sum that down into 3 things, which is, what did you do to prevent this from happening? What did you do once it happened? And what are you doing to stop it from happening again? Now, from the first part of that conversation, if the ICO were to come to knocking on your doors because you had a data breach, if your response to them is, well, back in the first quarter of 2018, we did a lot of work around GDPR and we got lots of policies in place and we did lots of assessments, but we've done very little since the 24th of May because we thought we'd done everything and everything was fine. That is not the place to be. That is definitely not the conversation you need to have. The ICO themselves said, look, if something happens, we want you to tell it, tell it fast, tell it all, and tell the truth. So you're going to have to tell them what you actually did to actually prepare for GDPR and what you've done to ensure that this is an ongoing program. For me, good security, and when I say me, when I talk to other data protection and info security practitioners, when we say that we're looking for demonstration that an organization is really thinking about data privacy in a different way, we say that it's not a thing that is bolted onto the side. It's not something that somebody else does. It's something that is part of the culture. And that's culture can only be changed over time. We often say that good security is like a diet. It's something that it's almost like a lifestyle change. I think most of us, if not all of us, at some point in our lives will have been on a diet. We know what works, we know what doesn't. Quick fix diets that start in January and finish in May so that you're ready for your June holiday don't work. They work in the short term, absolutely, categorically. But you are still going to have the conversation in December that says, well, what do I do next year? I need to get healthy. So if we start to think of good security as more of a lifestyle change rather than it being something that somebody else does or we do it only for a short space of time, then I think we can be successful. So going back to the beginning, are we still talking about this? Absolutely. I think we have to be talking about this, and we always should be, because we always should have been talking about data protection. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on to this webinar. I hope you found that of interest. I think you are free to take yourselves off mute if you wish to ask any questions. I'll be happy to take any questions. Okay, well, I will take no questions from anyone. It means that, as my teacher once said to me, it means that if there are no questions, it means you've understood everything or you've understood nothing. I do hope it's the former. Thank you very much. And if you would like to contact me, my contact details are on screen now. If you'd like a copy of the slides, drop me an email and I will send over the slides too. But thanks once again for taking the time. I do appreciate it. And I hope to speak to you in the near future. Thanks very much.